At 12:01 a.m. on July 24th, 2026, while most of America was asleep, something happened that most people still don't fully understand. The United States government imposed brand new tariffs on 60 countries, covering 90.4% of everything America imports. Not 50 countries, not 30, 60. Practically the entire planet's trading system, repriced overnight by executive order. Here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. This wasn't the first time in 2026 that Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on the world. It wasn't even the second law he'd used to do it. This was the third legal doorway the administration had walked through in 12 months, because the first two had already been kicked shut. One of them by the Supreme Court of the United States itself, in a stinging 6-3 ruling that said, essentially, you don't have the power you think you have. So here's the mystery at the center of this video. If the president's own Supreme Court told him his tariff powers were illegal, how, 5 months later, did even bigger tariffs go into effect on more countries than before? What changed? What law did they find? And why does almost nobody seem to be talking about the fact that America has now tried and burned through 3 completely different legal justifications for the same basic idea in a single year? By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how we got here, why this pattern has a name almost a century old, why some economists are calling this the biggest structural shift in global trade since the 1970s, and why the next 12 months may determine whether this ends in a negotiated new world order or a repeat of the worst trade catastrophe in American history. Stay with me. Because the story starts, strangely enough, not with Trump, but with a nearly 50-year-old law most Americans have never heard of. Setting the stage. The hidden machinery. To understand what happened in 2026, you need to understand something most news coverage skips entirely. The President of the United States does not, technically, have the constitutional power to set tariffs. That power belongs to Congress. It's written directly into Article 1 of the Constitution, the power to tax and regulate commerce with foreign nations. The founders put it there deliberately because tariffs are, at their core, a tax, and they didn't want that power sitting in the hands of one person. But over the last century, Congress has quietly handed pieces of that power away, through a patchwork of statutes, each one written for a specific emergency, each one a narrow tool for a narrow purpose. Section 232 from a 1962 trade law lets a president impose tariffs when imports threaten national security. Section 301 from a 1974 law lets a president retaliate against countries engaging in unfair trade practices. Section 122 from that same 1974 law gives the president a temporary emergency tool, but caps it at 15% in 150 days. And then there's IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, a law originally designed to let presidents freeze the assets of hostile foreign governments and terrorists during declared national emergencies. Here's the twist nobody saw coming. In early 2025, the Trump administration reached for that last one, IEEPA, and used it to justify something it had never been used for in the law's entire 48-year history. Not sanctions, not asset freezes, blanket global tariffs. Why does this matter? Because IEEPA has no built-in caps, no percentage limit, no time limit. If a president could tax imports simply by declaring an emergency, they would hold something close to unlimited economic power over the entire global trading system. Power that, again, the Constitution says belongs to Congress. Keep that detail in your back pocket. It's going to come back and detonate the entire system in February 2026. Origins. How the first domino fell. The story begins on February 1st, 2025, just days after the new administration took office. Citing an emergency over fentanyl trafficking and illegal immigration, the White House issued executive orders imposing tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, invoking IEEPA for the first time in this way. Officials framed it as a public safety measure, not a trade measure. Import taxes on drug precursor chemicals crossing the border, that was the pitch. But that was only the opening move. On April 2nd, 2025, a date the administration itself branded Liberation Day, the White House went far beyond drug enforcement. Using that same IEEPA emergency authority, it announced sweeping reciprocal tariffs on nearly every country the U.S. trades with. The stated logic, America's trade deficits with the rest of the world constituted a national emergency in themselves. If a country sold more to America than it bought, that imbalance was treated as a threat justifying a tax. This was the moment the post-war global trade order, the framework built by the U.S. itself after 1945 to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral tariff war, effectively cracked. Tariff rates jumped on friend and rival alike. Rates over 30% hit some nations. Over 40% hit others. Stock markets around the world convulsed within days. And almost immediately, the lawsuits began. Multiple businesses and a coalition of states sued, arguing something that sounds almost too simple to be the crux of a Supreme Court case. EPA lets a president regulate imports during an emergency. It never says he can tax them. Regulating and taxing, the plaintiffs argued, are two entirely different constitutional powers, and only Congress holds the second one. In August 2025, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit agreed, ruling en banc, that the tariffs were, in the court's own words, unbounded in scope, amount, and duration. That's about as close as a federal appeals court gets to saying, this is exactly the kind of unchecked power the Constitution was written to prevent. The administration appealed straight to the Supreme Court, and for the next several months, an uneasy truce held. The tariffs stayed in place while the country waited for a verdict that would decide not just the fate of Trump's trade policy, but the outer boundary of presidential power itself. The rise. Living under the tariff wall, while the legal battle played out, the tariffs weren't paused, they were running in real time, reshaping the American economy month by month. By the end of 2025, tariff revenue collected under IEEPA alone reached somewhere between $175 and $179 billion, according to Penn Wharton budget model estimates, a sum larger than the entire annual budgets of the Department of Transportation and the Department of Justice combined. That's not a symbolic tax. That's one of the largest de facto tax increases on American consumers and businesses in a generation, imposed without a single vote in Congress. And the administration didn't stop at the blanket tariffs. Throughout 2025, it layered on more. A 25% tariff aimed at India tied to its continued purchases of Russian oil, steel and aluminum tariffs under Section 232 that doubled from 25% to 50% by June. Copper added to the list. Secondary tariffs threatened against any country seen as helping Russia sidestep sanctions. Here's the number that should genuinely shock you. Even with all of this in place, even with tariffs stacked on tariffs covering the vast majority of American imports, the U.S. goods trade deficit didn't shrink. It grew. By the end of 2025, it reached $124 trillion and was up 2.1% from the year before. The stated purpose of the entire policy, closing the trade gap, was failing in real time, even as the tariffs themselves were collecting record revenue. In manufacturing, the sector tariffs were supposedly designed to protect. It shed 88,000 jobs over the course of 2025. Not gained them, lost them. This is the pattern worth sitting with for a second, because it's going to repeat later in the story in a different century entirely. A policy sold as protection for domestic industry, generating enormous revenue and enormous disruption, while the underlying economic problem it claimed to fix got worse, not better. Foreign governments, meanwhile, weren't standing still. Canada's government accused the U.S. of violating its own trade agreement, the USMCA, a deal Trump himself had signed in his first term. Retaliatory tariffs and diplomatic standoffs multiplied. Businesses that relied on predictable trade costs, everything from car manufacturers to grocery chains to small importers, found themselves recalculating their entire cost structure every few weeks, because nobody, including the government itself, could say with confidence which tariffs would survive the courts. The breaking point. The Supreme Court strikes then came February 20th, 2026. In a consolidated case, Learning Resources, Inc. vs. Trump, joined with Trump v. VOS selections. The Supreme Court delivered its verdict. By a vote of 6-3, in an opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts, the court ruled that IEEPA simply does not authorize a president to impose tariffs at all. The reasoning was almost elegantly simple, and it echoed exactly what the lower court had found. The power to impose tariffs is, in the court's words, very clearly a branch of the taxing power. A power the Constitution reserves for Congress alone. IEEPA lets a president regulate imports during an emergency. It does not, and never did, give him the power to tax them. Both major pillars of the tariff program collapsed in that single ruling. The Reciprocal Liberation Day tariffs and the fentanyl-related tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. Together, those two categories had made up roughly 70% of the entire U.S. tariff architecture built over the previous 13 months. Financial markets and foreign capitals reacted immediately. This was, by multiple legal analysts' accounts, one of the most consequential Supreme Court trade rulings in modern American history. For a moment, it looked like the story was over. The court had spoken. The tariff wall, built without Congress, had been ruled unconstitutional in its foundation. But here's the twist that makes this story worth telling at all. The ruling didn't end the tariffs. It just ended one legal path to them, the fallout, rebuilding the wall, brick by different brick. Within hours, not days, hours, of the Supreme Court's decision, the president signed a new proclamation, this time invoking a completely different law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, The temporary emergency tariff authority Congress itself had written decades earlier, capped at 15% and 150 days by design. A new 10% global tariff went into effect on February 24, 2026, 4 days after the ruling that supposedly ended the tariff regime. And the very next day, the administration signaled it intended to push that rate up to 15%, the statutory maximum. Meanwhile, the practical mess of unwinding the old tariffs was its own quiet disaster. More than 1,000 businesses had already filed for refunds on tariffs the Supreme Court had just ruled illegal, potentially billions of dollars in payments the government had already spent. Customs and Border Protection couldn't simply flip a switch. It needed executive guidance, system updates, and eventually a federal judge had to pause a refund order just to give the agency time to build a process inside its own database systems. The government that had collected roughly $175 billion under a law the nation's highest court just called unconstitutional now had to figure out, case by case, who might get some of it back. A process still unresolved as of this taping. This is worth pausing on because it reveals something important about how modern tariff power actually works. Even a landmark 6-3 Supreme Court defeat only closes one specific legal doorway. It does not touch the other doorways still standing. And this administration had more than one door. The failed fix. Section 122 was never meant to last. Here's the catch the administration understood better than almost anyone watching from the outside. Section 122 was never designed to be permanent. Congress built in a hard 150-day expiration specifically so that no president could use it as a substitute for real, congressionally authorized trade policy. It was meant as a stopgap, a temporary bridge, not a foundation. That bridge was set to collapse on its own on July 24, 2026, exactly 150 days after it began. And so, in the months leading up to that deadline, the administration went hunting for door number 3. In June 2026, U.S. trade officials proposed a new justification entirely, one that had nothing to do with trade deficits or emergency drug enforcement. This time, the claim was that dozens of countries were failing to adequately enforce bans on goods produced by forced labor. The legal vehicle, Section 301 of the same 1974 Trade Act, the statute built for retaliating against countries engaged in unfair trade practices following a formal investigation. On July 23rd and 24th, as the Section 122 tariffs expired at midnight, the new Section 301 tariffs took their place without a single hour of gap. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer laid out the scale of it plainly on CNBC. It covers 60 countries, 60 and about 99% of our trade. The new structure, 17 countries that had adopted at least partial forced labor import restrictions, got hit with a 10% tariff. 5 more faced blended rates between 10% and 12.5%, depending on the specific product. And 38 countries, including major economies like China, Brazil, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Switzerland, and Japan, were deemed to have failed enforcement entirely and were hit with the maximum 12.5% rate. Notice the pattern. 3 different laws, 3 different stated justifications. Drug trafficking, trade deficits, forced labor enforcement, invoked in rapid succession over 18 months. And in every single case, the practical result looked nearly identical. Broad tariffs on dozens of countries announced by executive proclamation, with Congress never casting a single vote. Even economists sympathetic to strong trade action noticed the pattern immediately. Columbia Business School economist Laura Veldkamp put it bluntly on public radio. This really looks like an excuse to try to resurrect the original tariffs under some other guise. The modern parallel. We've seen this movie before. Now here's where this story connects to something almost a century old, and why so many economic historians have started reaching for the same uncomfortable comparison. In June 1930, in the early, still unfolding days of the Great Depression, President Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, a law that raised U.S. duties on more than 20,000 imported goods, some ultimately to nearly 60%. The pitch, at the time, sounds almost identical to arguments you've heard in the last 2 years. Protect American farmers, protect American factories, shield the domestic economy from a struggling world. More than 1,000 economists signed a public letter warning Hoover not to sign it. He signed it anyway. What happened next is one of the most studied cautionary tales in economic history. Other nations didn't sit back and absorb the hit. They retaliated with their own tariffs aimed squarely at American exports. Global trade didn't just slow down, it collapsed by roughly 65% within a few years. American farmers, the very group the law was supposed to protect, saw export markets evaporate. Most economists today believe Smoot-Hawley didn't single-handedly cause the Great Depression. But it took an already fragile global economy and poured gasoline on it, deepening and prolonging the collapse for years. The parallel isn't that 2026 is 1930. It isn't. The modern economy is more diversified, more services-based, and far more globally interconnected in ways that both help and complicate any tariff war. But the structural pattern is eerily consistent, and it's worth naming plainly. A stated goal: protect domestic industry, shrink a trade deficit, defend national security, used to justify sweeping, largely unilateral tariff action, escalating retaliation from trading partners. Rising costs passed down to ordinary consumers and businesses, not foreign governments. And in both cases, remarkably, the underlying economic imbalance the tariffs were meant to fix getting worse. Not better? A $124 trillion trade deficit that grew, not shrank, even as tariff revenue hit record highs. There's one more parallel worth sitting with. After Smoot-Hawley, it took the United States nearly a century to build the opposite kind of system, the GATT, and later the World Trade Organization, specifically designed to prevent any single country from unilaterally reshaping global trade through emergency-style tariff powers. The entire modern trading order, in other words, was built as a direct response to the mistake of 1930. What's happening in 2026 is, in a real sense, a test of whether that post-1930 architecture still holds, or whether it can be walked around, one statute at a time, by a determined executive branch willing to try door after door until one stays open. 3 takeaways. So what do you actually walk away from this story understanding? 3 things. First, legal authority and political power are not the same thing. A 6-3 Supreme Court ruling, about as decisive a legal defeat as exists in American law, didn't end this policy. It redirected it. If you're trying to predict what happens next in trade policy, don't just ask, is this legal? Ask, how many more legal doors are left standing? Because in this case, the answer was at least 2 more. Second, tariffs are a tax on your own country, not just a punishment of someone else's. The data from 2025 is unambiguous on this point. Tariff costs were overwhelmingly absorbed by U.S. importers, businesses, and consumers, not by foreign governments. The trade deficit tariffs were meant to shrink, instead grew to $1.24 trillion. Manufacturing jobs, the supposed beneficiaries, fell by 88,000. Whatever the political framing, the economic mechanism of a tariff hasn't changed since 1930. Someone inside the country buying the import pays the tax. Third, history doesn't repeat exactly, but the structural pattern of protectionism does. Escalation, retaliation, and outcomes opposite to the stated goal. You don't need to believe 2026 will end like 1930 to recognize that both stories follow the same basic architecture. That's not a coincidence. It's what happens almost anywhere sweeping trade barriers get imposed quickly, unilaterally, and outside the normal deliberative process a legislature is built for. The open question. Here's what nobody can answer yet, and it's the question worth sitting with as you close this video. Section 301, tariffs, unlike the improvised emergency powers used before them, rest on a much sturdier legal foundation. An actual statute Congress wrote specifically to authorize this kind of action after formal investigation. That means this version of the tariff wall may be far harder to challenge in court than the last 2 attempts. If that's true, the pattern of the last 18 months, sue, win, watch the administration pivot to a new law, may finally be running out of room. Which raises the real question this video leaves open. If the courts can no longer be the check on this kind of sweeping, unilateral trade power, what can? Congress hasn't reclaimed the authority the Constitution gives it. Trading partners are retaliating case by case, not collectively. And the American consumer, so far, has simply absorbed the cost, deal by deal, price tag by price tag, mostly without noticing where it came from. Is this the beginning of a genuinely new global trade order? One where tariffs become a permanent tool of American foreign policy rather than an emergency exception? Or is it 1930, moving in slow motion, with 100 years of institutional memory doing nothing to stop it from happening again? Close call to action. If this kind of deep dive into the machinery behind the headlines is something you want more of, the laws, the loopholes, the historical parallels, nobody's connecting for you. That's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, because this particular story is nowhere near finished. And I want to know what you think. Is this a necessary correction to decades of trade imbalance, or a rerun of the worst economic mistake of the 20th century? Drop your take in the comments. I read everyone. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.